Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. And both Rory and I hope that you are well. You've joined us on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 252. Three stops on today's journey, starting off with theory and practice, where we look at how theory shows itself in the day-to-day practice of counselling and psychotherapy. And today we're going to be speaking trauma bonding. We then move on to practice today, where we look at contemporary issues, challenges, or wins that we face in counselling. And today we're going to be speaking about changing your ethical body. That's an interesting thing. We might change an insurer or a gas provider. Do we change our ethical body? We'll be discussing that. And then into practice matters, which is the CPD part of the Counselling Tutor podcast, where you met up with Sally-Anne Armitage, use of empathy, Rory, in counselling.
Yeah, really exciting interview and crucial part of our work.
Yeah, I think no matter what your modality is, there's going to be something there for you. So starting off with that theory and practice, Rory, trauma bonding, before we look at how that might present within the therapy room, what is trauma bonding?
Well, trauma bonding is where an individual may be in some sort of abusive relationship and either can't leave or keeps going back. I want to share a personal story. I've never shared this story before. I don't think I've told anybody, so I don't think I've even told you, Ken. But when I was about 11 or 12, I was hanging around with a group of friends, and a lad came and punched me on the nose. I lived in Gorton in inner city Manchester. It was the 70s, so that was the kind of thing that went on. To be honest. And then he went away, and he didn't live near me. But I knew him. He used to deliver the papers around where my friends lived. Anyway, one day I was walking along down the Burnham Road where I used to live, and I looked down this road and I could see him, and he must have been about 300 meters away. It was quite a long way away, but I could tell it was him. And I made a detour, walked down the road, and gave him sixpence, which is 2.5p in old money. And for years, I beat myself up about that until I studied trauma and realized that what was happening is I'd formed a trauma bond with someone who effectively had abused me. My way of coping with it was to try and give him sixpence. And if I think about it now, if I think about my young self now, I think there's still a part of it that says how ridiculous. You could have just he probably didn't see you, probably didn't know who you were. But that's the nature. And what happens is that the brain starts to make a best decision on survival when there's a traumatic situation. And sometimes that part of the brain decides, the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain that sometimes takes over us, makes a decision to have a survival strategy. And that survival strategy is to go back to the abuser. And how that plays out in the therapy room is that we may work with clients and they're having a really bad time with someone, but they keep going back. And certainly I've supervised students who've said, I just don't know what's going on here. Why would they keep going back? There's lots of routes they could go to safety. But like my younger self, they turned left, went down that road and go back to the abuser. And I think the interesting part of it is that we know it takes a long time, a lot of events in someone who is experiencing trauma and abuse to be able to break away from the abuser. And part of our work in that, Ken, is to be patient, to be consistent, and also to be understanding of that process. And as in my case, to try and alleviate the shame of it, because the person knows, they will say to you, I don't know why I go back.
Yeah.
I don't know why I go back. And part of that can be psychoeducation, explaining that, as I did, that little process of how the brain works in a survival situation.
I'm so grateful that you shared that story, Rory. And the thing that stood out most for me is how you beat yourself up for years afterwards about going back. And I think that is one of the symptoms, I guess, of that trauma bonding is almost being drawn in, almost moth to a flame, like almost against one's will, and afterwards feeling, why did I do that? Why? And It's interesting. I'm glad that you brought this topic, and I think trauma needs to be looked at really carefully as a practitioner. And trauma bonding, I mean, I guess a form of trauma bonding would be Stockholm syndrome, and that is a commonly known word. And so we're looking where the abuser uses techniques such as gaslighting, emotional abuse, criticism, or physical violence, and the victims may use many methods as a survival mechanism, and they include that forming a bond, defending that person, thinking it's my fault, not their fault. And it can present itself, I guess, that way within our therapy room. And I think of someone who may have been physically abused, as you were, Rory, punched in the nose, and then going, well, you know what, maybe I was asking for that. Maybe what other choice could they have made? Almost defending the abuser would indicate a form of trauma bonding.
Absolutely. And I remember my friends at the time saying to me, well, you're acting daft, what do you expect? And I mean, thankfully we live hopefully in more enlightened times, Ken. And you're absolutely right. You made a reference to Stockholm syndrome. And for those of you who don't know what Stockholm syndrome is, it was an incident in Stockholm in the 1970s where a bank was robbed in Stockholm, and the people came in, the bank robbers came in with guns, held hostage the staff and the customers that were in. And it was a standoff, I think, for a number of days. The police eventually stormed or breached the bank and arrested the robbers. And what was interesting was that some of the survivors actually stood up for the robbers and said the police were too heavy-handed. And I think I might have mentioned this on the podcast. I heard an interview, I think it was on Radio 4 a few years ago, where the person still to this day stands up for the robber and paid for his defense.
Wow.
And in the face of all that evidence, look, they held you hostage, they had guns, they were violent towards you, they threatened to shoot you. The person still believed the police were wrong. And it's interesting, and I think that Stockholm syndrome is a step further. So it moves from trauma bonding into almost a pseudo belief system. Yeah. And everybody knows it's easier to change perceptions than belief. But we do see this in the therapy room, and I think I like to pick up on your point. The criticism of the person who's being abused, shall we say, reinforces their behaviour. They feel shame, they feel confusion, they feel they're foolish. Yeah. And I think a well-timed intervention from a therapist to say, look, this is what happens, this is how the brain works in trauma, can free people or start the process of freeing people from that cycle.
Yeah, it points out to me again and again the importance of doing CPD, the importance of learning and understanding how to work with certain kind of presentations. So if we were, as you used the Stockholm syndrome example there, Rory, which I like, and the words you used were, in spite of all the evidence, yep, the person still, and that is true in trauma bonding as well. So the friends and family might be going, why do you keep on going back? Why do you keep on finding yourself in then, and almost criticizing that person? You should do this, you should do that, you should do the next thing. It's obvious that this is happening, you need to break away from. And all of that is not necessarily helpful. It's about the person finding their own way, but we need to be there. And I think that you mentioned it, Rory, patience being so important, patience and empathy for how it is for that person, for that victim. I'm going to use the word victim here because that's exactly what the person is. If they're still undergoing that abuse at some level and experiencing that trauma and finding themselves caught there, what a horrible place to find oneself. And I think that doing the CPD to understand how we might work, because it's a tricky area. What happens if that abuse is harm to others, and within your contract you have that as needing to break confidentiality, and something that was shared with you in confidence suddenly has a whole group of other professionals surrounding that person? we need to tread carefully when working with trauma. It is not wise to dig deep into trauma without the appropriate training and CPD.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I also think that good supervision is absolutely essential at times like this.
Yeah.
A supervisor who's trauma informed, who has a trauma informed background, will be able to give you, useful observations and useful context for you to work with a client. But I think undeniably the strongest emotion for trauma bonding is sometimes shame and confusion too. Shame and confusion, because the process is unknown. It just happens. Like me with the sixpence, the process just happens, and you're left with, well, why did I do that? And it's only until someone explains how your brain works, you go, that's the reason why. And here's how you can work, maybe able to work with it differently and manage that feeling. And it's okay. 9 out of 10 humans would have done the same thing. And that is such a relief, I think, to hear that from clients.
Normalizing. And I guess, you brought that example of yourself of going through that process, beating yourself up for years. And then your words were, until I started studying trauma. So there was that normalizing, realizing it's not just me. This is part of the human condition. There's not something wrong with me. I'm not wonky. I'm not less than. This is a normal way to react in that kind of a situation. And I guess you found some relief in that, Rory, and maybe clients can find some relief in that as well.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I when I was putting the topics together for the podcast, I thought, as we do when we make it a podcast, how can we make this more interesting? How can we make it more relevant? And it just came back to me in a flash. And I have to say, if that person's listening, I want my sixpence back.
Oh, Rory. So, really interesting topic, trauma bonding. We've got a handout for you. Rory's taken some time to put it together, explaining what it is, and given a really nice list, a bullet list of what we might look out for a client saying or the way they're presenting. And you can get that by going to our mother website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Click on the top menu bar on the podcast tab, find your way to episode 252 right there on that page with the show notes. You can download your super duper handout for free on trauma bonding. You just put in your email address and we will send that over to you. So there you have it. Anything else on trauma bonding before we move on, Rory?
Well, I think just to look at that handout and to, inform yourself on trauma-informed practice. It's presenting more and more in the therapy room. It's becoming more prevalent from my colleagues and my own experience. So, by being more informed about it, you're going to be a better service to your clients.
Yeah, and I guess, Rory, you have a trauma-informed practice course that you have put together. How might people find out about that?
Well, what we'll do is we'll put a link onto the show notes page of episode 252. And if you're interested in the trauma-informed practice course, click on that, send you some free resources so you can have a look at. And if you wanted to join and work through this 30-hour CPD course, self-directed learning in your own time, come in and join all the other people who've taken the course and become trauma-informed.
Thank you. And there you have it. That's our theory in practice for today. Moving on now to practice today, where we look at something that is contemporary, something that is of the now, that affects us as counselors, psychotherapists. And today, changing your ethical body. Does one change an ethical body, Rory?
Well, I think one does, Ken. And this is something that comes up a lot in our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, then go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, and you'll find our Facebook page. Knock on the door. Our friendly moderator will let you in. You can join thousands of like-minded people, students, qualified colleagues, supervisors, tutors, all talking about issues in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And one of those issues is changing ethical bodies. And I think to put some context into this kind of piece is that there's a bit of a pyramid when it comes to ethical bodies. And sitting at the top of that pyramid, so those watching on YouTube, I'm drawing a pyramid in the air now, the top of a pyramid in the air, is the Professional Standards Authority. So in recent years, we've had what we call voluntary regulation in the counselling profession, certainly in the UK. And there is an organisation that sits right at the top of that food chain, which is called the Professional Standards Authority, and a number of ethical bodies, and there's about six or seven different ethical bodies, then accredit themselves with the Professional Standards Authority. And it's their specific, it's the Professional Standards Authority's specifications that they build into the ethical bodies build into the ethical frameworks and their policies and procedures. So they sit below the Professional Standards Authority. So in my case, I was a member of the BACP for a number of years, and I decided to change my ethical body. I decided to have a look round. Ken alluded to gas companies and electricity companies. And I thought it was really important that I found a body that fitted with my values and my value system, because being part of an ethical body is part of a kind of an ecology of your practice. In other words, it's as important as finding your supervisor, making sure you got the correct insurance, choosing your CPD. And I decided after a lot of thought and some supervision to move to the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, NCPS. And I've got to tell you, the change was absolutely painless. It took a week, and I'm now a member of the NCPS. Got a lovely email from them. Anything they can help with. They have a members area. They have their own code of ethics, which, to be honest, most of the codes of ethics align now. But one thing I like about the NCPS is their code of ethics is a little bit more granular, a little bit more precise. And we'll see how we go. But I'm enjoying the experience. And the key thing was it was so simple to change. We see these adverts for, just click on this button to change your gas and electricity. Well, it wasn't a click of a button. I had to send some documentation in, but very little, all done by email, very professionally handled. And I got my information through just the other day. So that's the breaking news. And I would say to you, you have a choice. Most people have a choice. There are ethical bodies for those who've done specific training, psychoanalytical training, or maybe they, Association of Christian Counsellors for people who have a faith position and want to align their faith position with their counselling practice. But generally speaking, there's two ethical bodies, and you do have a choice. And I think it's really important. I also think it's important for students to have a choice. Given now the new hierarchy, I think if you're a tutor, I think it'd be useful to offer your students a choice. We talk about autonomy. Well, why not practice that in terms of offering ethical body membership? And one final thing, Ken, is that if I was looking for a job in counselling, a lot of employers now want you to be part of an ethical body. And the NCPS is now a recognised body. Employers, I had lunch with a friend of mine who's a HR manager. We got talking about recruiting counsellors, and she said to me, yeah, well, we don't particularly look for particular ethical bodies. We look for if they're accredited to the Professional Standards Authority, because that's what really counts in terms of accountability and handling complaints. So yeah, they're all equal, and you make your choice. I'm not telling people to change. I'm just saying that I had a look at mine, and like my gas company, I press the button and I'm with someone else.
Yeah. And as always, we say this so often, we're not here to tell you which ethical body you should join. That's for you to make your choice on that. We're here to discuss the fact that you can change. And I think that I saw a post just recently, and somebody was speaking about their ethical body, and they were saying, what do I really get other than to pay money each month. And I think when you find yourself in that kind of a situation, it's worth looking around. Look to your ethical body. What do they provide for you? What are you getting out of that? Is that a match for you, your practice, your values, your client group? Understanding the value that you get from it, from your ethical body is really important, and knowing that there are different ethical bodies kind of aligned in the ethical frameworks because of the professional standards. Is it PSA, Professional Standards Authority? Is it, Rory? Yeah. Don't want to misquote that. But they may have a different way of presenting themselves. Like Pepsi is a cola and Coke is a cola, and they're both colas, but they might taste slightly different, and some will prefer one and some will prefer another one. And of course, there's not just two colas, there's many colas, as there are, is it six here in the UK, 6 ethical bodies for counselors and psychotherapists. Just make sure it is aligned with Professional Standards Authority, because there's nothing to stop anybody setting up an organization and saying, we stand for counselors who wear glasses association, and this is our ethical framework. But the question is, do they align with professional standards? Because if they don't, then it kind of doesn't fall within that pyramid, as that Rory was saying. There's choice. There's time. You get a choice if you're a student and about to become a student member. There might be a requirement in your training provider to become a professional, to become a student member of an ethical body. When you go into placement, perhaps look around, see what is available, who are the players, and then see who is right for you. What are you offered? What are the benefits? What do you get access to? How do they align with your values and your way of working? And I guess just seeing that there is a choice and that we can from time to time review that business side of what we do, I guess, the office side, maybe not business side, the office side of what we do.
Absolutely, Ken. One of the things that's really struck me is that in all the times we taught and students had to do research projects, can you remember anybody doing a research project on ethical bodies?
Nope.
No. So I think that would be really, really useful as a piece of research, because you could research the pros and the cons of one ethical body, why someone might want to join one and not the other. An interesting piece of research. It's an area that really isn't talked about. It's a bit like joining a bank. I joined a bank my parents joined when they had a bank, and my daughter joined the same bank. And my daughter has now changed her bank, and she's with a different one. And I think it's useful to know that choice is important. It's important for clients. It's important in training, and by golly, it's important when you're thinking of an ethical body, Ken.
I like that you used a bank. I think that's a great parallel or way to describe this, because changing a bank, when you're 100% right. I joined also the bank that my parents belonged to quite happily. Why? Because that was what I knew. And I have changed banks. And I remember going through the thought pattern of changing banks, and it seemed like massive hassle, really difficult. I pictured myself going and having to draw all the money out from the teller and walk it across the street to a different bank and go in and fill out loads of forms. But it is relatively painless. There are systems in place to switch providers. We live in a world where there are different providers, there are choices, and there are mechanisms in place to move over. And as you say from your experience, Rory, you moved your ethical body and you found it absolutely painless. In fact, you were pleasantly surprised.
I was pleasantly surprised. I went onto the website. They asked me a little bit of information. They asked me for some details from my previous ethical body. I pressed the button. I had a cup of tea and a Garibaldi. And 2 days later, I got a cheery email asking me for just a little bit more information, which I sent. And then that was it. And of course, we had to pay the fee. We had to pay the fee. And that was it. And I was absolutely stunned how easy it was, because I was expecting, like you, to have to carry documents and
all your CPD hours in a file over.
Yeah, swearing oath of allegiance and that type of thing. Nothing like that. Really, really, really simple to do. And I think, I think a vibrant, debated economy within ethics is a good thing. Yeah. As a group of therapists, no matter which modality or where you stand on, your modality, to be able to debate these things and make a choice, I think is brilliant, because that's what we're choice enablers at the end of the day as therapists, and we should be able to enable that choice for ourselves.
Yeah, just one final thought as we kind of leave practice today. If you do look around and you do decide or make a choice to change your ethical body, be sure that the next phone call or the next email is to your insurer, just to update them, because when you would have taken out your insurance, you would have said who your ethical body was at the time, and you don't want outdated info with your insurer, just to kind of close that gap. Right, moving on into practice matters. Rory, you met up with Sally-Anne Armitage, who has done a number of lectures for us at Counselling Tutor, notably one very recently on risk. And it's not about risk. It's just, it was very well attended. So if you attended that, you'll know Sally-Anne, amazing lecturer. And you met up with her to speak about the use of empathy, Rory.
We did, and once we'd stopped having a giggle and we did 3 or 4 takes, because Sally is a mate of ours, we produced a wonderful interview where she talks about the importance of empathy and how we kind of bracket empathy from other skills. And she outlined this in her lecture, but she also spoke very eloquently about it in our interview, and this is what she had to say. Empathy is the cornerstone of any therapeutic engagement. Without empathy, it's almost impossible to form any sort of therapeutic alliance and for therapy and therapeutic change to take place. So I'm delighted to welcome back one of our regular presenters, Sally-Anne Armitage, who has done a fantastic lecture in the CSR library on empathy. So Sally, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Rory. Thanks for having me. Yeah, we're here again, aren't we? We've got to stop meeting like this.
Yes, people will talk. Letters and Facebook groups will be talking. So I think it's very easy, isn't it, to say, oh, empathy. It's the essential ingredients in therapy. But what actually is it when you're using it therapeutically? Having the dictionary definition isn't quite the same as when you're using it in practice.
I think the thing that I've noticed when I was planning the lecture is people think things are empathy that are not, and they think they might be being quite empathic, and they're not. And I give some examples. This is a nice lecture. It's good. I liked it. I watched it. I don't normally do this, but I ended up watching it again, and I was like, it's a good lecture. So I recommend it. I know that's a bit, blowing me on trumpet, but yeah, it's a good lecture. So as part of it, I put together a couple of conversations, one that's quite empathic and one that's maybe not particularly empathic. And it's with the best will in the world, we say things like, you'll be all right. I've been through similar and I managed to get through. You've got to pick yourself up. And people who say those types of things, it's easy to say they're really empathic, they're really caring, but that's not really empathy. Empathy is being able to get your frame of reference and put it to one side and enter into the frame of reference of another person.
So in a case like this, what would an empathic response be? You've given us a non-empathic response, somewhat coming from the therapist frame of reference, but what would an empathic response look like?
So I'm going to say an easy way, and I've stopped myself. But the best way to give an empathic response is a reflection or a paraphrase, in my opinion. To show your understanding, to rephrase what's been said by the person, but not in such a way where they'd be like, "That's what I just said." So it's a skill, and it does take practice. But I think that's the best way to show empathy.
Yes, and as my old tutor said, it's paraphrasing, not parrot phrasing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I like the idea you've linked 2 skills to empathy. One is reflection, and I'm taking that's the reflection of emotion in the speaker's voice, and the other is paraphrasing, in other words, repeating back what somebody has said, but as you quite rightly point out, in slightly different language, from a slightly different perspective, maybe.
Yeah, because what happens is, again, this is in my example, is inadvertently when we start to reflect back what we've heard and paraphrase back what we've heard, almost without meaning to, the person who is speaking, the client, starts to say more and say more and say more. And when you start saying more, you start getting more learning from what you're saying. Stuff starts coming out that could be useful. And I've been really careful, because when you reflect and paraphrase, we're not suggesting that, if you reflect and paraphrase, someone will be fine within an hour and they'll be skipping out of the door. That's not what we're suggesting. We're suggesting that this is the way to carry out an empathic conversation, and it is for the good. I think it can be easy to sort of think, well, I don't see change quickly, so is it working? Yeah, but sometimes these things do take time, especially when it's, issues that have been going on for a long time. It can take sessions,
Absolutely. And I think you brought up something really interesting there. If empathy is used correctly, as you say, incites a permission from the client or to the client to be able to speak more about themselves. It opens them up as opposed to closes them down. And crucially, it opens them up on their own terms so they can share what they feel comfortable with. They don't feel under any pressure to share or disclose information. And that's really important it's really important in therapy in general, but it's absolutely crucial in engagements where someone may have experienced trauma or abuse. They need to decompress themselves in the therapy room gradually, as opposed to letting it. Some may do, but they have permission to be able to share as much or as little as they like.
Exactly, and that's the thing, and that's why you may, if you're studying, you may hear tutors say things of the kind: reduce your questions, reduce them right down, because really, I mean, I like the idea of trying to remove them completely just to get that practice in, of not instantly, there's a bit of quiet. So what does your husband think about this? It does really bizarre questions that can really kind of come out of nowhere, and be very in the frame of reference of the therapist. So this is why questions you might hear, don't ask as many questions if you can, because it leads a person out of their own experiencing and down a road that you're suggesting they go down, which is external, which is away from the self.
Yes.
Because it's like you said, it's bringing about that opportunity for introspection and internal sort of thought processes. That's what we want to bring about, really.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that when you start asking questions, you're asking people to use the thinking part of their brain, as opposed to the emotional part of the brain. When I was teaching, I used to say, if you ask a thinking question, and I used to touch my head, I'd say, this is what's enacting, and I'm just tapping my head for those people who are listening to the podcast. That's that tapping sound. And then if
that sound of wood.
The sound of wood. Yes, thank you so much, Sally. And how empathic of you. And if you allow people and use empathy, what happens is you're kind of working with their heart, the emotional side of them, and you're absolutely right. What do other people say? What does your husband say? Your partner say? What do your friends say? That's the opposite of empathy. That can really close people down, I think.
Oh, it certainly can. It certainly can, and lead them away from what they're going through. And like, just thinking about what you said about leading people into the cognitive mind, the thinking mind, that can be a really good way of bringing a session to an end. If somebody's really heightened and upset or angry or absorbed, getting them to answer a question from their cognitive mind can be really useful to de-escalate and to get them ready to leave. I know it's a bit different to empathy, so I'm only going to mention it quickly, but things like, it's nearly tea time, you're having your tea at some point, what you're going to have, just to take them into that cognitive mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think empathy, or as our German friends may say, Einfühlung, which is the root of the word empathy. I'm just being smart now, Sally, sharing that information. With people listening, groaning away, going, "Oh, Rory's being smart again."
He reads a lot of books.
Yes, I do read lots of books. Yes, I think that I think it's a really important ingredient. You know, one of the things that really strikes me is it's quite a hard process to learn and to work with when you first start training, because it's opposite, isn't it, to how sometimes we communicate on a daily basis.
Yeah, it definitely is. It really is. And add to that the maybe nerves with what we're doing, you know, that you're training and that you're trying to do these skills that you're not used to, and you might be more self-conscious, so more aware of what you're saying and more aware of yourself, which takes you away from someone else's frame of reference. So it's tough, and it does take practice. And you're right in what you say, like in normal interactions, if I rewind my life 15 years, it's funny really, before I trained to be a counsellor, I used to listen to conversations and be part of conversations, and I used to feel an intrinsic sort of, why are you saying that? That's not useful. And I used to see people speaking to each other and say, you know, I don't understand why that's not compassionate, that's not loving, that's not useful. And I could see people hurting each other. So when I went on my level 2, I was just like, it's like everything I'd always thought of made sense. Like this is it. This is what we need. This is what people need. So yeah, you do know. Well, I noticed a difference, a real marked difference in how people talk when they're trained and when they're not trained.
Absolutely.
So it's getting rid of all that learning that you might have done about how to converse and changing it.
It is really interesting, and I think one of the things that I took away from my training, and I was over 20 years ago when I trained, was to listen to the music behind the words. Sometimes what people say and the emotional tone of their voices are at odds, and I think part of empathy is as you say, to reflect that emotion. And you know, there's been times when a client said something, and I said, you know, you say you're very happy at this, but your voice is sad when you say it. Is that would you say that was a form of empathy?
Yeah, definitely. It's giving your attention over totally to somebody else's experiencing and trying to attend to somebody's frame of reference. And those things on the edge of awareness I find so powerful to be able to observe and point out. You know, you're speaking about, for example, a client, you're speaking about a really happy occasion where it went really well, but yet your leg's going at 10 to dozen. You know, is that just something that your leg does, or are you feeling more than perhaps, you know, you're saying?
Yeah.
So I think it's just that really attention to detail. It's like you say, when the words don't line up with how they're being said, or somebody's speaking and something has sudden, really strong significance. You know, it sort of changes in like, for example, you might have somebody talking about family and they just want to fill you in because it's an early on, and they're just like, oh yeah, so I've got my mum and I've got my dad, I don't see them much, and I've got my uncle. Yeah. And then I've got my cousins. Oh, uncle's really important then. Yeah. You know, so just seeing that slight shift and bringing it into awareness can be really useful.
It is, and you know, sometimes I used to say to my students, sometimes words just hang in the air. You know, someone says something, and there's one word that it just has more emphasis on it, or more strength in the voice, and I would say, in the case of the uncle, your uncle, just wait, and then what happens is, my uncle was great. He was the best of all my family, and he always took care of me. And then you're on that edge of awareness. You're moving on a different path, and there's lots of debates about, you know, whether to highlight words in certainly in the person-centered tradition. Some people may say, well, that's a bit directive. You're picking the word that you're highlighting. Yeah. Others may very well say, you know, what you're doing is you're tuning in. You're emotionally tuning in to the client and pointing out something that's quite powerful to them in the context of that conversation.
Yeah, and we're not the idea is, for me, I'm not trying to be clever. I'm not trying, here's this singer that's gonna amaze your client. Here's my, intellect to come and baffle you and amaze you. That's not the way I'm coming from when I do this. It's a tentative acknowledgement of what I've seen.
Yes.
And the client might well say, oh, I don't know. There's no, it's... Usually they don't, if I'm honest, but they could just say, no, there's, I don't know what I meant there, because there's nothing, there's nothing there. But more often than not, they say, oh, yeah, well, that's another story. Okay, is it a story you want to talk about, or do you want a story you want to leave,
Yeah.
And just be interested.
Yeah, and I think from a client's point of view, I've as a lot of therapists had therapy. To be on the receiving end of empathy is quite unusual, and it can feel a little uncomfortable from my point of view. For a stranger to kind of listen that deeply, and it struck me that I was going in directions in terms of my emotional process that I'd never gone before. And I've been a therapist for 20 years. Yeah. I would have thought, well, I kind of know this stuff. But it didn't work that way. I mean, I knew fundamentally it didn't work that way, but I was quite taken back when I had my own therapy, just what routes we took, just through the use of empathy.
It's wonderful, really. I speak to supervisees, trainees, and qualifieds alike. That if you provide somebody with a space where they are truly the centre of the attention, and they are valued and prized and not judged, and they know they're not, and it's a space that's sort of dedicated to their ease, And it's amazing where it goes. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's about that atmosphere that we're trying to bring about for the client, that if they can speak freely and there's no filters and there's no sort of fear of judgment, the conversation goes where it needs to go. But it's that trusting in the process thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the client's direction and they choose it. So as we come to the end of this interview, Sally, I wonder what you'd hope that people who watch the lecture would take away from it.
Ideally, and this was one of my motivations for how I built it, I would hope that I would challenge some of the preconceptions people have about empathy. Maybe invite listeners to identify that some of the stuff they may have thought was empathy is not. And go forth and share that learning, go, if you're doing a triad and you see the types of things that, you learn about in this conversation, that this pretend empathy or this supposed empathy, be able to say, I'm not sure that is empathy, because that was in your frame of reference, sort of spread the word, really, because empathy is, it's one of the core conditions, isn't it? It's right up there. So it's so important.
Absolutely. The lecture on empathy is in the CSR library now. So Sally-Anne Armitage, always a joy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Sally-Anne. A big thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out and arranging that interview with Sally-Anne. Empathy, it doesn't matter what your modality is, it is part of your way of being in counselling and psychotherapy. And we know that a lot of students write about empathy, learn about empathy, experience changes in themselves and how they perceive empathy throughout their training journey. And that's why Sally-Anne did a full lecture on empathy, which is in the Counsellor Study Resources. It's our student resources. So if you're a member of that, you can log in, search the library for empathy, and you will see that lecture. If you're not a member of the Counselling Study Resources, you can find out more information by going to counsellingtutor.com. This has been episode 252 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started with theory and practice. We talked about trauma bonding, the process of where someone who's been abused or traumatized may form bonds with their abuser. Then we moved on to practice today, changing your ethical body. We spoke about how, certainly in the UK, how easy it is just to change your ethical body and become a member of a new ethical body. And then we moved into practice matters, and we had an interview with Sally-Anne Armitage, who talked about the use of empathy, a link to a lecture which is in the CSR and CPD library. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.